Okay, well, I think we will consider reconvening, and as we begin getting ready to move into our final session for this morning, thinking about technology and humanity. If we have the first slide up, please, that'd be fantastic. Thank you, wonderful. Thank you very much. So I hope you enjoyed the stretch break. I was saying to Liz that when I saw stretch break on the program, I thought she was going to come up and actually lead us. Yeah, other people are nodding. So maybe we should encourage that in the next little stretch break before the Q&A. You know, a bit of aerobics, Liz. Get the. No, there's a definite. That's not happening. Never mind. Anyway, I thought it was a lovely idea. Well. Technology. Where do we begin thinking about this one? I think the best place to begin thinking about technology is to start our story, the story of technology, over 250 years ago. It was a fine spring morning in 1746, and a French clergyman, Jean-Antoine Nollet, he got 200 monks, as you do, and he lined them up in a field. And he had each monk connected to the monk next to him by a length of copper wire. That ended up being a line of monks about a mile long. Nollet then connected the first monk in the line to a primitive battery, causing electric shock to pass down the line, and every monk to go, ah, and jump in the air, like this. Something like that. Why did he do this? Well, he wasn't a monastic masochist. He did this because Nollet, someone actually likes that joke, thank you. Nollet was like a lot of clergymen in that period. He was also interested in science. There was quite an overlap between the early sciences and folks who were religious leaders playing around in those fields as well. And Nollet, like other scientists in the period, was convinced that electricity held the key to developing some kind of long-distance communication device. And the work of him and others led in time to the invention of the electric telegraph, which revolutionized the world. Because until the invention of the telegraph, until that point, the fastest speed that technology, that information could be transmitted was at the speed of a running man, a galloping horse, or a ship, or a train. So information was somewhat restricted. But with the telegraph, suddenly information can now travel at lightning speed, and the telegraph revolutionized the world. In fact, arguably, it's one of the significant inventions that made the modern world. And you see, when technology changes, but especially when communications technology changes, that changes culture. And just as writing and the printing press did, then telegraph, then radio and TV have done before, so the internet and digital technology have changed our world and are continuing to change our world and our culture at lightning speed. You know, we are more connected, aren't we, than ever before. In fact, surveys show that the average person here in the UK spends a third of their waking time on some kind of digital device. I won't embarrass people by doing a survey and ask you to raise your hands, but I suspect some of you may even, the first thing you did before you got out of bed this morning was look at your phone. Maybe some of you sat on the lavatory this morning and multitasked in some way. I confess I actually did the crossword in the bath this morning on my iPhone. That was my sin for my sins. And we are addicted to our digital devices. Over 3 hours of that time, on average, is spent on social media. The average person in the UK spends 3 hours a day on social media, which is astonishing because probably some of you in this room aren't on social media, which means there are some people spending much, much more of that time. Yet despite all of that connectivity, all of that digital connectivity, we are, surveys show, lonelier than ever. Recent survey that was done revealed that 25% of students here in the UK report that they feel significantly lonely all or most of the time. 60% of students said they feel chronically lonely at least once a week. This is the generation who are most plugged into their digital devices, yet levels of loneliness are at almost epidemic levels. While you raise the age level, and 20% of adults here in the UK report that loneliness is a major struggle and a major issue for them. So whatever technology is doing, it's not solving our problem. But here's an interesting question. Is technology part of the problem? Could our digital connectivity and the epidemic of loneliness that surveys after surveys are picking up here in the UK, could they be connected? Could the amount of time that we spend staring into screens, be they our laptops or our tablets or our phones, could that somehow be related to the massive crisis we are seeing in mental health in this country around things like loneliness? And the answer is that many scientists think there is, in fact, a connection. One of the psychologists who's been tracking this most famously over the last few years is the American psychologist Jonathan Haidt. He's written many books on this, given TED Talks on the subject, very well known as a researcher working in this area. And he has been tracking particularly the impact of digital technology on students, those Generation Z, those born between 1997 and 2012. And in a recent talk he gave, he quoted, with permission, an email that a Canadian university student had sent him. It makes for fascinating reading. Let me read you this email from this student. This student writes, "My generation is incredibly isolated. We have shallow friendships. We have superfluous romantic relationships that are mediated and governed to a large degree by social media. There is hardly any sense of community on campus, and it's not hard to see why. Often I'll arrive early to a lecture to find a room of 30-plus students sitting together in complete silence, absorbed in their smartphones, afraid to speak and to be heard by their peers. This leads to further isolation and to a weakening of self-identity and confidence, something I know because I have experienced it." That from a 21-year-old university student. You know, I wonder whether one of the problems we are facing as a culture is that, of course, technology offers us the fantasy that we need never be alone. It offers us the fantasy you need never be alone because there's always the phone in your pocket. But that constant connection has resulted in many of us actually not knowing what to do when we are alone. We're terrified of being alone, even many of us as Christians. When we find ourselves alone, we become anxious, we become fidgety, we become distressed. Just look what you do when you're stuck in the lineup at the coffee shop, waiting for your coffee. How many of us, if we're honest, reach for the phone in our pocket and bring it out? We need something to distract us. We can't just stand there and be. We cannot deal with being alone, so we try to solve the problems with our phone. And one of the problems here as well, I think, is that related to this, at the same time, the other problem that with technology, it offers us this myth of companionship, but it isn't real companionship because it brings with it none of the demands for real friendship. And so again, we're forgetting how to form deep relationships. Sherry Turkle, another American psychologist who's been working in the area of technology and loneliness for some years, brought out an amazing book a few years ago called Reclaiming Conversation: The Power of Talk in the Digital Age. And Sherry, another person, does lots of work with young adults. Some of the conversations and the research she reports, and this is fascinating, but this little paragraph really struck me. She said, "We turn to our phones, or we say we turn to our phones when we're bored. And we often find ourselves bored because we have become accustomed to a constant feed of connection, information, and entertainment. There is even now a word in the dictionary called phubbing. Phubbing means maintaining eye contact while texting." A few nervous looks here. People in the room, maybe one or two of you are masters of this. She says, "My students tell me they do it all the time, and it's not that hard. But all of this adds up to a flight from conversation, at least from conversation that is open-ended, spontaneous, conversation in which we play with ideas, in which we allow ourselves to be fully present and vulnerable." But whether or not technology is a help or a hindrance when it comes to issues like loneliness and connection and relationship, especially among young adults, I think there is a much bigger question lurking behind all of this, and it's an evangelistic question. In some ways, it's a question we can ask our friends as we try and start spiritual conversations. The spiritual conversation lurking in the room for me is this one: why is it that we long for connection in the first place? You know, I often like to ask my friends, have you ever wondered why it is we struggle with loneliness as human beings. We have this desire to be connected. We want relationship. We want to feel included. Does that desire for connection reveal something deep about us as human beings? I mean, for one, it would certainly rule out the ludicrous idea you hear in some circles that we are nothing more than meat-based computers. So the American computer scientist Marvin Minsky once memorably said the brain happens to be a meat machine. So look at things like this and they go, there's a reason he's a computer scientist and not a motivational speaker, because quite frankly it's just depressing. Clearly our need for a relationship shows there's much more going on. But if one was an atheist or a skeptic, couldn't our skeptical friends say, well, surely our desire for connection is just driven by the fact that we're social primates, and so like other primates we've evolved to operate in community, and that's what animates us as human beings? To which I think the Christian answer is we're certainly not less than that, but we're certainly more than that, which is why it is possible as human beings for us to feel alone in a crowd of people, and why we want much more out of our friendships than just fighting, fleeing, reproducing, and picking fleas off each other. Hopefully for many of us, we want more out of our friendships than just those four things. So could our desire for connection, could it be a clue? Could it be a signpost about something much bigger in how we were designed? Well, there's another wonderful book on technology that I found really helpful, came out a few years ago, written by a journalist called William Powers. William is not a Christian, has no religious faith as far as I know, just is a very interesting observer of humanity. But in this book on technology, Hamlet's Blackberry, which is a great title for a book, I was struck by, as I was beginning to read it through, this fascinating little paragraph near the start of it, which really made me think, yeah, I think he is on to a big question here. So if you're struck by the thing that struck me, near the start of his book, William writes these words. He says, when you start wondering about your own busyness, pretty soon you're pondering much deeper questions, such as, is this the kind of life that I really want? From there, it's just a short hop to the big league existential stumpers. Why are we here, and who am I? My word, those are big questions. In other words, he's suggesting that one of the reasons maybe we have this strange, uneasy relationship with technology is we all know that we're too busy and spend too much time staring into the black mirrors of our phones. But once you start asking that question, once you start wondering, am I too busy? Am I too addicted? Am I spending too much time online? That I want connection? That raises this massive question of, are human beings created for more than that? What are we created for? As human beings, you are right onto the question of what is the purpose of life. And as a Christian, I get excited in conversations with friends and neighbors and colleagues when I can get my friends thinking about purpose. Because purpose is a really interesting area to talk around. And of course, purpose is crucial because it's figuring out what the purpose of something is that lets you decide whether it's being used well or used badly, right? For example, if you were to get talking to me after the session today, before you head out for home, and I happen to mention to you that although I may look happy, I'm actually feeling a little bit grumpy today. And you say, well, Andy, what's wrong? And you say, well, last week I went to the jewellery store and I bought a new watch, and they ripped me off. They sold me a bad watch. You go, oh, really? What was wrong? What's the problem? And I went, well, I'll tell you the problem. Last night I was putting up some shelves for my wife. I was doing some DIY before coming up here to Aberdeen. I was hammering in nails with my watch. Hammering in nails with my watch I was, and my watch broke. It fell to pieces. There were bits all over the floor. It's a bad watch. I suspect you might say a couple of things. I think firstly you might say, would you like the number of a good therapist here in Aberdeen? Because clearly you've got a couple of issues. But then secondly, maybe you would gently put your arm around me and go, Andy, let me explain to you the purpose of a watch. The purpose of a watch is to tell the time, and we determine whether it's a good watch or a bad watch by how well it does that thing. And you'd be absolutely right. You'd be 100% right. But of course, that raises the $64 million question, doesn't it? What is the purpose then of a human life? If we tell whether a watch is a good watch or a bad watch by knowing its purpose to tell the time, and we measure it against that, how do we tell whether a human life is a good life or a bad life? How do we tell if the choices that someone's making, the way that we're living our lives, is good or bad, unless we can first answer that question of what we are actually here for? And maybe answering that question, I often like to suggest to my friends, maybe if we can press into that question of what we're here for, maybe that will help us deal with massive, big issues, like the issue of loneliness and why we have this epidemic in our society right now. You see, fascinatingly, loneliness is a very modern phenomenon. It's a surprisingly modern phenomenon. There was a writer, the historian Faye Bound Alberti, a few years ago, wrote a book called A Biography of Loneliness, in which she traces the idea of loneliness and traces it back through history and literature and movies and films and art and so on. And in that book, and again, as far as I know, she has no religious background, none that I can find out, so she's just a historian. She observes in that book that the modern idea of loneliness, with its negative connotations, that word did not really, or wasn't really used that way before about 1800. Before about 1800, you don't find people talking about being lonely or using the word loneliness as a negative thing. Now, that clearly can't be because before 1800, people were never alone. That's clearly not the issue. But what's interesting, before about 1800, when people were on their own, the word that tended to be used was more the word solitude. Solitude was the word that people would use, and solitude was a positive thing. You would aspire to it, you would look for it, you would long for it, you'd see that as a really good thing. It was a positive idea. So she asks in her book, what changed? How do we go from, in about 200 years, from solitude being a good thing to loneliness being a bad thing? And fascinatingly, she argues, purely with her historian's hat on, that one thing that changed was a loss of belief in God. Loss of belief in God in society. Because if you believe in God, of course, you are never alone. Even when there's no other human beings around, you are never wholly alone because you have the presence of God there with you. But if you don't believe in God, then when you are on your own, you really are truly alone. Now, of course, that's the point where a skeptical friend might say, well, okay, fantastic. All you've proved, Andy, is that faith in God is a psychological crutch. It's a psychological crutch to get you through life. If you can't cope with being on your own, you find that a pressure, therefore you invent God, believe in God, you're never alone, you've got your invisible friend, isn't life wonderful? Well, of course, the problem is, as we talked about earlier, you can explain anything away using psychology, as I alluded to earlier. If there is a God, if God really is real, as we Christians believe, then of course it's atheism that's the psychological delusion. It's atheism that's been invented by people clinging to some kind of comfort so they can live their lives without accountability. And whenever I hear somebody bring psychology into the conversation, I always want to say what really matters is not how we feel about belief or non-belief. What matters is what's really true. And I often say to my skeptical friends that what I will say is that belief in God, the existence of God, explains why we are wired for connection, and by the way, it explains why we're passionate about things like truth in the first place. But when it comes to God in these conversations with folks, it's very crucial that we are clear with our friends which God we are talking about. There are lots of different conceptions of God out there kicking around, and it's important that we point out that our Christian belief in God is very different from some of the concepts of God that you'll find in other religions and belief systems. Steve spoke a bit about this earlier. I wrote a book about 2 or 3 years ago called Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God?, which goes into this. And by the way, we talk about at SOLAS, we go into hostile, difficult places, would value your prayers, because on Wednesday next week, I'm in Aylesbury, down on the Hertfordshire-Buckinghamshire border, where I'm in a large secondary school for the day, and I have 2 sessions, one with the Socratic Society, which is largely hardcore atheist philosophy sixth form types, and I've also got a big RE lesson with 3 year groups where they're having me speak on do Muslims and Christians worship the same God. 19% of the students in that school are Muslims, so it's going to be a very interesting afternoon. You are a very friendly audience by comparison. But what I'll be saying to those students is it matters which God you're talking about, because particularly when it comes to these issues of loneliness, the God of the Bible has some very profound things to say about this question of loneliness and connection. For example, first of all, the Bible tells us that God designed us for a relationship and connection. We read that in the very first pages of the very first book of the Bible. We see that God designed us for a relationship with Him and relationship with each other. And that's, by the way, why as human beings our hearts are ultimately restless, why we struggle with loneliness, why we risk damaging our human relationships by expecting our human friends to validate our entire identities. Because as the ancient African Christian Augustine put it almost 1,600 years ago, he famously said, our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. We are designed for connection as human beings, and if we are not plugged into the God who made us, things are going to go wrong for us in all kinds of ways. But then secondly, of course, the Bible doesn't leave it there. The Bible points out that God did not create us to be robots or slaves or slightly smarter than average primates, but he created us to be sons and daughters. That's the incredible invitation that God makes. And I found that when I've started talking to friends, starting from the issue of technology and going through the way I've walked you through this morning, through connection and loneliness and into what faith has to say about this, actually people are quite receptive by this point, because as a Christian we have something very unique to say here, that God is not some distant potentate who wants nothing to do with us, who wound up the clockwork of the universe and disappeared off, but a God who created us and invites us to be adopted into his very family through Christ, to know that deep connection. But then thirdly, of course, the Bible also is clear, that is very honest about our problem. We are separated from God because of our rebellion and our self-centeredness. We've turned our backs on God. We've tried to make ourselves the center of our own little universe. And we have often tried to use people as means rather than ends. And the result is the deep brokenness and the alienation and the anxiety that we see all over our society. Those are the fruit of that particularly toxic tree. But of course, the Bible says that we've turned our back on God. He did not turn his back on us, but stepped in the person of Jesus into history so that we might know him. And I'm always at huge pains in my friends to say, look, at the heart of the Christian faith is not some abstract idea of God, but a God who is up close and personal. The Bible says if you want to know what God is like, we look at Jesus Christ. And this is interesting, because when you look at Jesus, there is something very interesting about relationships there that I didn't notice for many years until I was researching this theme and reading the Gospels, thinking around this. You see, Jesus was a person who was deeply connected. He was deeply connected to God. He had this incredibly deep relationship with his Heavenly Father. He was also somebody who was deeply connected to people. People were drawn to him, and the crowds were drawn to him, and he had these deep relationships with his closest followers. He was a very, very connected person. He was also often alone. He would go out into the wilderness to pray. He spent time alone. He experienced solitude. But only once in the story of the ministry of Jesus in the Gospels, only once do we hear of Jesus being lonely. Only once do we hear that. And that moment was when he was crucified and abandoned by his friends, abandoned by his followers, and abandoned by God. We have these astonishing words of Jesus on the cross, quoting the Psalms, when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" What was going on? Well, of course, what I find incredible here is at the heart of the Christian faith, uniquely among all the world's faith traditions, lies this amazing and unique and phenomenal claim that Jesus took in the cross our sin and our brokenness and our rebellion. He took it onto his shoulders, and he gave up his connection with God in order that we might experience connection with God. He gave up that connection that we might know that connection. And therefore, what's on offer for those of us who place our trust in Jesus is forgiveness and reconciliation, welcome into God's family, adoption as a beloved daughter or a beloved son. And that joy of knowing that even when you may be on your own, even when you may experience solitude, you are never alone and you are never lonely, because God's presence goes with you. You know, we live in an information-saturated age. We're drowning in data, yet we are lonelier than ever. So I always want to say to my friends, you know, I'm so grateful that God did not send an app or a download or a piece of information, but in Jesus, he sent himself. But finally, one final thought for you. You know, whenever changes in communication technology come, as I said at the start, they change culture profoundly. If you change how people communicate, you change culture profoundly. But history is encouraging here, because history tells us that whenever changes in technology have come, Christians have always been, the church has always been, actually pretty good at embracing that technology and finding ways to use it for the gospel. So it was Christians, for example, who were early adopters of the Codex, the book. We don't know who invented the book. It was some Roman artisan sometime around about the turn of the BC era into the AD era. Some artisan somewhere had the idea of chopping up bits of papyrus, stitching them together, and it was much more handy and portable than the scroll. And when Christians were writing the Gospels and beginning to distribute the Gospels across the ancient world, somebody in the early church had the brilliant idea of going, that is the thing we want. That is the ideal technology platform for the Gospels. And Christians helped spread the use of the book across the ancient world. It's an exciting story. 1,500 years later, we had the printing press, Gutenberg's printing press. And of course, if you know your history, one of the first world-changing things to roll off the printing press was Gutenberg's Bible. And it's the same story as you scroll through history: telegraph, radio, TV, and in time, the internet. Every new technology brings its challenges, but every new technology brings tremendous opportunities for evangelism and for the gospel. And Christians, we have always been at our best when we have both used technology and we've grabbed hold of it and gone, this is phenomenal, let's use it. But we've also been at our best when we've helped people think carefully about it. Because the internet has changed the world more than any other invention before it. And so it's vital that we use it and we grasp hold of it, but that we are also people who are asking good questions, biblical questions, theological questions, missional questions. So we can use the technology well, we can communicate clearly in the digital age in which we live, but also we can ask good questions and we can help people wrestling with the challenges this new technology brings. Because ultimately, there are no simple answers when it comes to some of the dark side of digital technology. Issues it raises around things like busyness and loneliness, identity, tribalism, many more things we could talk about. But those are great themes to start conversations. And time again, I've found when people say to me, I'm busy or I'm distracted, or they mention the problems of their phones, I found a great way into a gospel conversation to say, what would you like life to look like? What would life look like if it was going well and you weren't surrounded by all of this digital clutter? It's amazing the answers that you'll hear. And finally, of course, in a world of busyness where people are drowning in data, we can't keep up with our email or our messages, we're spending far too much time online and we feel completely pulled in 1,000 directions, as many of us do and our friends do. I think it's time we need to remind our friends again and again of those incredible words of Jesus. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And that promise held true in the first century with all of its pressures. And that promise holds true in the 21st century when a lot of those burdens and weariness and pressures are digital ones. Because Jesus is the one who truly offers us rest, because he is the one who created us, knows what we are created for, and desires to put us back into the right relationship for which we were intended. Thank you for listening, and we're doing another quick stretch break. No exercises, I'm afraid. Again, she's, apparently that's not on the agenda today, but we'll take a 3-4 minute stretch break, and then Liz is going to come up and MC us as we have Q&A. So you might want to be thinking about what questions, what have I said, or Gavin said, or Steve said that you'd like to ask about, or if there's a burning question to do with sharing our faith with our friends and neighbours and colleagues that isn't even remotely related to any of the 5 talks this morning, feel free to ask it as well. And if you have a really difficult question that you'd like Liz to answer, I'm sure she'll be more than happy to do that as well. We'll see you in 5 minutes.